This video will teach you how to repair a loose crankshaft assembly on a Schwinn Airdyne Evolution Comp exercise bike. Hello, today is April 3rd, 2016, and this is my Schwinn Airdyne Evolution Comp exercise bike that I purchased new in November of 2011. This bike is about 4.5 years old, but unfortunately it's in need of repair today. The last time I rode this bike, all of a sudden everything started feeling loose. The handles started feeling really loose. The crankshaft and the pedals started feeling really loose. And upon closer inspection, I found that this bottom bracket bearing has a threaded nut on there that came completely off. So if you've got a Schwinn Airdyne bike that's the same model as this one, or a similar model, this video will teach you how to repair that bottom bracket and tighten everything up so that you can continue to use your exercise bike. Let's get a closer look now at the crankshaft assembly on the Schwinn Airdyne. So right here, if I grab the pedal and I move it back and forth, you can see that there's just way too much wobble in it. And you can especially tell that it's just not tight in here, in this area, where the crank assembly meets with the bottom bracket bearing. And here we see what the real problem is. If I zoom in really close, you can see this ring that's actually come completely off of the bottom bracket bearing. So we need to take this bike apart and basically tighten that back into the bottom bracket bearing in order to make a proper repair. Taking a look at this parts diagram on my computer screen, we can see that part number 26 here is a sealed cartridge bottom bracket bearing, and we can also see the threaded ring that has come off of that bearing. We can also determine that there are a lot of parts that we're going to need to disassemble in order to get to that bottom bracket. Before we dive any deeper into this repair project, let's talk about the special tools that you're going to need in order to make a professional repair. The first tool that you're going to need, and you can actually rent one of these or you can borrow one from a mechanic, but this is a torque wrench, and specifically this one is a Tecton brand half-inch drive torque wrench that I purchased via Amazon for $39. And what you need the torque wrench for is basically to tighten that bottom bracket ring that has come off. And I'll kind of show you how that works right here. So let me just pull this off. This is another tool that you're going to need, and it's called the bottom bracket removal tool. It costs $6.95, and this particular brand is Bike Hand brand YC-26BB. These cost, like I said, $6.95 a piece. The torque wrench $39. This tool right here is called a compact crank puller. This one is a Park Tool brand CWP-7. It costs $13.46. All of these parts are available, or these tools are available online via Amazon. So what this bottom bracket removal tool that attaches to your torque wrench is going to be used for, it's going to be used on your bottom bracket, and you probably don't need to purchase one of these. I think I only paid $14.50 for this particular one, but this is just for illustrative purposes. I'm going to show you exactly what's wrong with the Schwinn Airdyne. This is a bottom bracket bearing, and what's happened is through use, through rotating the pedals and such, this ring worked its way off, and now it's just sitting on the bike loose like that, and that's what's causing all the wobble when I try to pedal the bike, or when I try to move the arms back and forth. It's creating a lot of wobble because this ring has come off. So we need a good way of putting that ring back on. And the way that we do that is with this bottom bracket removal tool. So it's got teeth on it see the bottom bracket removal tool has 24 teeth. It's meant to engage these 24 teeth on this ring, and so basically if you imagine the torque wrench on here, we got to get this back up on there and we've got to thread it in. We got to turn it and tighten it to 40 foot-pounds of torque with a torque wrench, and that will make for the professional repair job. So that's what these special tools are used for. The other tools that you're going to need is this is a Allen wrench set. It's a metric Allen wrench set. This is a 6mm size, which you're going to need, in an 8mm size that you're going to need. So you can either buy the set or you can just buy the individual wrenches, 6mm and 8mm. You're going to need just a standard 1/2-inch wrench. This is an open-end box end wrench. This one is, I believe, a Craftsman brand. Then you're going to need a couple of just standard crescent wrenches, and you're going to need a number 2 Phillips head screwdriver. And those should be all the parts, the tools that you need in order to make a professional repair of the Schwinn Airdyne. Okay, the first thing we need to do is take our 8mm Allen wrench, and we need to remove this left side, the left and right side crank arm bolts. So we just insert our Allen wrench, and then we turn counterclockwise, and remove that shoulder bolt. After we get the shoulder bolt off, next thing we need to do is take our crank remover, loosen it up a bit, put it right into those threads, screw it on. Then we need to take our large crescent wrench, put it over that larger nut to hold it in place. Take our smaller crescent wrench, put it down here, and then turning clockwise, we loosen the crank, this crank arm, and see with that crank remover tool, it's very simple to remove that crank arm assembly. Okay, now using our 6mm Allen wrench and our 1/2-inch box end wrench, we're going to loosen this nut back here from this shoulder bolt. So we just put the box end wrench on that nut, and using our Allen wrench, we turn counterclockwise to loosen the nut back here. And once we get that nut loose, we can pull it off by hand. And there's also a washer back here that can come off. And now we're ready to remove the connecting arm, but we got to be careful. We got to basically support the weight of this because it's going to want to come crashing down. So we just kind of move this back and forth, and we pull off the connecting arm, set it down, and now this pivot arm, which is very heavy, wants to come crashing down. And we can just remove that shoulder bolt, and we can set down very carefully set down the pivot arm, and now we can remove the connecting arm and set it down. Okay, now the next step is that we want to take off this plastic shroud here, and basically it's just held on, it's bolted on with 4 screws. There's one here, one here, one here, and one over here. And so with our Phillips head screwdriver, we simply just remove each one of these screws. And once we have the screws removed, then we just simply pull it off. Okay, once we have the left and right plastic shroud removed, then it's time to remove this eccentric crank. And the first thing we have to do is, using our 8mm metric Allen wrench, we remove the eccentric crank bolt. And once we have that bolt removed, then we can use our crank puller again and thread it right in there. And then we use our large crescent wrench for the big nut, and then the smaller crescent wrench for the smaller nut. Apply some pressure, and we pull the eccentric crank right off. And so then that exposes the problem with my particular bike, and that is this ring came off of the bottom bracket bearing, and that's why everything is so loose. Now the quick repair is, of course, just to get this threaded back in there, and turning it clockwise, we could thread it back in there. But I want to show you some additional steps to take for getting to the chain and lubricating the chain and such, so I'll show you that next. Okay, now moving over to the right side of the bike, we do want to remove the bolt that holds the eccentric crank onto the sprocket here. So using our 8mm Allen wrench, we just need to loosen this bolt, remove it, and once we have that removed, we use our crank puller again to separate the eccentric crank from the bottom bracket. Then using our crescent wrenches and turning, now we can just hand turn it. Now it's very loose, it's ready to come off. And we can remove the chain by lifting up the spring that holds this little sprocket, and then we can just kind of offset this chain and then rotate it right off, and then this sprocket comes off. And now we can just simply push this bottom bracket bearing out, and there, it's all been removed. Now if you need to remove the ring for the bottom bracket, this right ring, this is where you use your 20-tooth bottom bracket removal tool, and it's designed to, those 20 teeth will fit right into the slots on this ring. And then you can use your crescent wrench to put it on there. You can either use a crescent wrench or you could use a 1/2-inch drive wrench, and then you rotate it clockwise to loosen it. And then to remove it, you just keep rotating it clockwise. And off comes that bottom bracket bearing ring. Now, upon closer examination of this bottom bracket bearing, after I cleaned it up, I noticed that it doesn't look like it's damaged at all. It's still in great shape, and so I think all we need to do in this case is to use a little bit of white lithium grease to go around the races of this bearing, and we'll just reinstall this bottom bracket bearing. Okay, now we're going to thread this bottom bracket bearing ring back into these threads here, and we insert it and we turn it counterclockwise to tighten it. And once we get it hand tightened, now we can use our bottom bracket bearing removal tool, and I'm using my torque wrench, although I haven't got this set to a particular torque because since we're working in a backwards direction, we just simply want to get it in there until it's nice and snug. Okay, so I'm going to show you just once again from the left side of the bike. We want to go ahead and insert the bottom bracket bearing. And then we have the bottom bracket ring that we need to thread on there. And we do that by rotating it in a clockwise direction. And once we get that hand tightened, now it's time to use our torque wrench. Okay, now that we've got this hand tightened, it's time to get out our torque wrench, and we take the bottom bracket removal tool and just snap it onto the torque wrench. Alright, and then we just want to make sure that we have it set so that we can tighten it as we go in a clockwise direction. So now we need to take the torque wrench and set it to 40 foot-pounds of torque. And so on my torque wrench, I just need to rotate this till it hits the 40-pound mark. So I'm just turning it till the zero hits the 40-pound mark. Now the torque wrench is set. So then we just insert the torque wrench right here, and we start rotating clockwise to tighten it. Okay, now that it's starting to get a little bit snug, this is where we will tighten it until we hear the torque wrench click, and that means it's tightened to 40 pounds. So here we go. And we just heard the click. So now the bottom bracket has been reinstalled and everything's been tightened to 40 pounds of torque. So that's nice and snug in there now, and that will make for a good repair for this bike. Now we just have to put everything back together again. Okay, so after you're done with your torque wrench, then you want to make sure that you just back off the pressure from the torque wrench and return it back to its lowest setting. Okay, so we're ready to start putting everything back together again. On the right side of the bike, we start by putting the sprocket back on, and we use our 8mm metric Allen wrench to just screw that bolt back in. And we want that very tight. And now it's time to put the chain back on. And we got to get that underneath that little sprocket. There we go. Looks like the chain is ready to go now. And then with our Phillips head screwdriver, it's time to put the plastic shroud back into place with the 4 screws that secure it on. Okay, now that we have reinstalled our plastic shroud and we've tightened the screws, the 4 screws that bolt it onto the metal frame, now we're ready to reinstall this connecting arm, and we're going to reinstall that onto this pivoting arm. And this pivot arm is, we have to be careful because it's very heavy and we don't want it to come crashing down. So we have this shoulder bolt that has a washer on it, and we're going to put that shoulder bolt with a washer through this pivoting arm, and then we've got a washer that slips right over the bolt like that. Now we can move the pivot arm up, rotate it upwards, and it's very heavy, so you got to be really careful. But now the connecting arm slips over it like that. Okay, and then we have a smaller washer that goes over the shoulder bolt, and then we've got a lock washer that goes right here on the end. And I'm not going to tighten everything up just yet because my connecting arm is still loose and I've got to get that over the eccentric crank. Okay, and now since we've got that bolt ready to go, now over here on this side we've got this washer that slips over the crank here, and then we take the connecting arm and we're going to have to pivot things a little bit, but that just slips right over the top like that. And now we're ready to tighten this shoulder bolt and the lock washer. So now, using our 1/2-inch wrench and our 6mm metric Allen wrench, we can tighten this back down. And that is getting pretty tight right there. And that should about do it. Now over here on the right side, I'm going to show you a slightly different angle so that you can see this better. This is the pivot arm, and here's the shoulder bolt with a washer. I'm going to put that through like so, and we're going to take the larger washer, slip it over that, and we're going to take the connecting arm, slip that on. We'll take the next washer, put on like that, and then we've got the lock washer. And we hand tighten that on, and then we just put our 1/2-inch box end wrench over it. Take our 6mm metric Allen wrench, and we're tightening now. Tightening the shoulder bolt. And we've got that nice and tight on there now. Okay, and then on the right side of the bike, we have another washer that we have to put over the crank. Then we have the connecting arm. And I'm just going to there we go. It's on now. Okay, now it's time for our last step, and that is reinstalling the pedals. The pedal crank, I should say. And before we do, we need to make sure that on the right side of the bike, we want our eccentric crank facing this way. And so I've just basically rotated everything, and so the crank is facing to the rear. And with that crank facing towards the rear, we want to install the pedal crank in an upward position, straight up. And then we take our bolt here, crank bolt, and then we reinstall that using our 8mm metric Allen wrench. And we want to get this really tight. And that's about as tight as I can get it. So I'm going to rotate that back up again, because now we got to go to the left side of the bike. Okay, now the last step is to put on this left side pedal crank, and you notice that the eccentric arm is pointed this direction. With that facing in that direction, we want to install the pedal down, because on the right side of the bike the pedal crank is facing up, so on this side we want it facing down. And then we get our bolt and our 8mm metric Allen wrench, and now we get to tighten this one up. And once again, we want to get this as very, very tight. And that's about as tight as I can get it now. This bike is repaired now. Everything is really, really tight again. And now we can enjoy our Schwinn Airdyne. Well, looks like our repair job worked, because here's my daughter riding on the Schwinn Airdyne. Everything's nice and tight. Everything's working again. So I think that we can call that good. This video will teach you how to repair a loose crankshaft assembly on a Schwinn Airdyne Evolution Comp exercise bike. Hello, today is April 3rd, 2016, and this is my Schwinn Airdyne Evolution Comp exercise bike that I purchased new in November of 2011. This bike is about 4.5 years old, but unfortunately it's in need of repair today. The last time I rode this bike, all of a sudden everything started feeling loose. The handles started feeling really loose. The crankshaft and the pedals started feeling really loose. And upon closer inspection, I found that this bottom bracket bearing has a threaded nut on there that came completely off. So if you've got a Schwinn Airdyne bike that's the same model as this one, or a similar model, this video will teach you how to repair that bottom bracket and tighten everything up so that you can continue to use your exercise bike. Let's get a closer look now at the crankshaft assembly on the Schwinn Airdyne. So right here, if I grab the pedal and I move it back and forth, you can see that there's just way too much wobble in it. And you can especially tell that it's just not tight in here, in this area, where the crank assembly meets with the bottom bracket bearing. And here we see what the real problem is. If I zoom in really close, you can see this ring that's actually come completely off of the bottom bracket bearing. So we need to take this bike apart and basically tighten that back into the bottom bracket bearing in order to make a proper repair. Taking a look at this parts diagram on my computer screen, we can see that part number 26 here is a sealed cartridge bottom bracket bearing, and we can also see the threaded ring that has come off of that bearing. We can also determine that there are a lot of parts that we're going to need to disassemble in order to get to that bottom bracket. Before we dive any deeper into this repair project, let's talk about the special tools that you're going to need in order to make a professional repair. The first tool that you're going to need, and you can actually rent one of these or you can borrow one from a mechanic, but this is a torque wrench, and specifically this one is a Tecton brand 1/2-inch drive torque wrench that I purchased